The Zenith Interplanetary Military Academy was renowned across 3 galactic sectors for producing the finest officers and specialists in the peacekeeping and exploration forces. Its sleek, imposing structures of gleaming metal and crystalline spires housed training facilities that pushed the limits of known technology, all designed to forge the next generation of leaders from dozens of sentient species. Cale Matthews was one of only 8 humans in his year, and the only one assigned to Squadron Delta. At 5'10", he appeared almost childlike next to the 7-foot forelag, whose Cthar physiology gave him not only towering height, but also a secondary set of arms and natural armor plating across vital areas of his torso. Even Zarel, the slender Cygnian analytical specialist, stood a head taller than Cale, her iridescent skin reflecting light in patterns that shifted with her moods. As Cale waited for his turn on the climbing wall during their 3rd week of physical training, he observed his squad mates with quiet attentiveness. The facility had programmed the wall to present different challenges to each species: adhesive surfaces for those without natural grip, wider handholds for larger appendages, and narrower paths for the more agile species. Matthews, barked Instructor Thax, a grizzled Vulturine veteran with eyes that could spot a flaw in stance from 50 meters. "You're up. Standard human configuration." Cale nodded and approached the wall, securing his safety harness with practiced movements. The whispers behind him were barely audible, but his hearing was actually quite good by human standards. Shouldn't they lower the difficulty setting for him? That was Lyra, the Re-Sin empath whose rose-colored skin flushed darker when she was concerned. "Academy standards are non-negotiable," replied Zarel, her voice perfectly modulated. Though statistically, humans have the lowest completion rate on this exercise. Cale tuned them out and focused on the wall. He knew his limitations: no claws, no adhesive secretions, no extra limbs, but he also knew his strengths: methodical planning, efficient movement, conserving energy for when it really mattered. He began climbing. His progress was steady, but noticeably slower than Forlag's powerful ascent had been. Twice he nearly lost his grip when handholds retracted unexpectedly. By the time he reached the top, his muscles were burning, and he'd taken nearly twice as long as the Cthar warrior. "Acceptable completion, Matthews," said Instructor Thax without enthusiasm. "Room for improvement." As Cale rappelled down, Forlag's primary arms were crossed over his chest, his secondary limbs resting on his weapon belt. A posture of Cthar superiority. "Perhaps next time they'll install a lift for you," Forlag said, mandibles clicking in what passed for amusement among his kind. Cale didn't respond. He simply unclipped his harness and moved to the sidelines to observe the remaining climbers. His silence seemed to irritate Forlag more than any retort might have. Later that afternoon, in tactical simulations, the squadrons were tasked with planning an extraction mission on a theoretically hostile moon with severe atmospheric interference. Orbital bombardment to clear landing zones, followed by heavy armor deployment, Forlag declared, manipulating the holographic display with confident sweeps of his lower arms. "Quick, overwhelming force." Several other cadets nodded appreciatively at the bold approach. The Cthar were renowned warriors, and their tactical doctrines emphasized decisive action. "Respectfully, I have an alternative suggestion," Cale said, speaking up for the first time that session. All eyes turned to him, some curious, others skeptical. The atmospheric interference would make precision bombardment unreliable, and heavy armor would sink in the moon's low-density surface crust according to the geological data. He stepped forward to the display, bringing up terrain cross-sections. "I propose a small team insertion here, using the natural cavern systems to approach the objective. Minimal footprint, reduced risk of detection, and we could exploit these underground gas pockets as distractions if needed." A moment of silence followed as the approach was considered. Then Forlag laughed, a harsh sound. "Hiding in caves? Is that how humans fight? No wonder your species controls so few systems." Cadet Matthews' approach shows consideration for terrain factors. Zarel interjected, her tone neutral as always, though it lacks the psychological impact of show of force. "It's just Very cautious, added Lyra, glancing between Kale and Forelag as if trying to defuse the tension she could undoubtedly sense. The instructor, a gray-skinned Tertian with decades of actual combat experience, studied both proposals silently before speaking. Both approaches have merits and flaws. In practice, the correct strategy would depend on mission parameters, available resources, and command priorities. Kale nodded, accepting the diplomatic assessment, though he noticed the instructor marking something in his notes. That evening, as Squadron Delta gathered in their common area, an announcement flashed across all their personal devices simultaneously. Field Exercise, Ricon 7. Duration, 72 standard hours. Equipment, Survival Kit, Limited Rations, Standard Protective Gear. Objective, Navigate to Coordinates, Retrieve Data Package, Return to Extraction Point. Squad Leaders, Report for briefing at 0500. Ricon 7, murmured Zarel, already accessing information on her neural interface. Recently discovered terrestrial planet. Minimal survey data available. Partial atmospheric breathability for most carbon-based species. Extreme temperature fluctuations. Indigenous flora includes several bioluminescent fungal species of unusual height. Sounds like a proper challenge, Forelag said, clearly pleased at the prospect of something more demanding than simulations. Kale said nothing, but immediately went to his storage unit and began reviewing his equipment. He checked his medkit twice, adding an extra roll of pressure bandage and a small tube of high-grade analgesic gel that wasn't in the standard issue. He studied the limited geographical data on Ricon 7, focusing on terrain features and potential hazards. Preparing for your inevitable injury, human? Forelag asked, noticing Kale's methodical preparations. Just being thorough, Kale replied, not looking up from his gear check. Your species does seem to rely on equipment to compensate for biological shortcomings, observed Zarel, who had packed her gear in a precise, optimized manner in less than 15 minutes. Only Lyra seemed to understand. I'm bringing extra supplies too, she said quietly. Unknown environments always present unexpected challenges. Kale nodded to her in appreciation, then continued his preparations late into the night after the others had retired to their quarters. The transport to Ricon 7 departed exactly on schedule the next morning, carrying Squadron Delta and 3 other cadet groups to different drop zones across the planet's northern continent. The journey through jump space took just under 4 hours, during which the squadrons received their final briefings. As the transport broke through the cloud layer, the cadets got their first view of their training ground. Ricon VII's sky was a deep violet, streaked with amber clouds that moved rapidly in the planet's severe wind currents. Below, jagged basalt formations rose like broken teeth from forests of towering luminescent fungi, some reaching 30 meters in height. Their caps glowed with pulsing blue-green light, even in daylight. Atmospheric analysis shows presence of metallophagic spores, reported Zarel as their drop shuttle descended. Low concentration, but sufficient to cause gradual deterioration of exposed metal surfaces. Recommendation: maintain protective gear integrity at all times. Temperature will drop approximately 40 degrees after sundown, added Lyra, reviewing environmental data. The fungal forests provide some shelter from wind, but increase exposure to spore concentration. Forelag, as their designated squad leader for this exercise, studied the terrain map with intense focus. We'll head northeast from the drop point, following this ridge line. It offers the most direct route to the first navigation marker and keeps us above the fungal level where visibility is better. The shuttle touched down on a relatively flat expanse of basalt, engines whining as they compensated for the gusty conditions. As the hatch opened, the cadets were immediately struck by the alien environment. The air carried a metallic tang even through their filtration masks, and the light had an unusual quality that made shadows seem deeper and more defined. Equipment check, ordered Forelag as they assembled outside. Communication devices, protective gear, navigation tools. Report any issues now. Everything was in order, and Squadron Delta began their trek across the forbidding landscape. Forelag took point, his powerful frame handling the rough terrain with ease. Zarel followed, constantly monitoring her array of environmental sensors and updating their topographical data. Lyra maintained position as their biometric specialist, keeping track of each squad member's vital signs through their integrated suits. Kale stayed in the middle of their formation, moving with deliberate, careful steps across the treacherous ground. 3 hours into their march, they encountered a narrow ravine that wasn't clearly marked on their incomplete maps. The gap was about 4 meters across, with an unstable-looking shelf on the far side. "We can jump this," declared Forelag, flexing his powerful legs. "The far edge will hold." "Wait," said Kale, crouching to examine the rock formation more carefully. "The composition here is different. Look at the striations and coloration. That shelf could be unstable." Forelag made a dismissive sound. "Your caution wastes time, human. Watch." Without further discussion, he backed up several paces and launched himself across the gap in a powerful leap. He landed heavily on the far shelf, which immediately cracked beneath his weight. Only his quick reflexes, grabbing onto a solid protrusion with his upper arms as his feet slid on crumbling rock, prevented a serious fall. After Forelag pulled himself to safety, he glared back at the others, daring them to comment. "Perhaps we should look for a narrower crossing point," suggested Lyra diplomatically. They found 150 meters downslope, where the ravine was barely 2 meters wide, and both sides appeared more stable. One by one, they made the jump safely, with Kale clearing the distance with a controlled leap that, while less powerful than Forelag's, landed precisely on the sturdiest section. As they continued their journey, the wind intensified, carrying visible clouds of the metallophagic spores. The cadets pulled their protective hoods closer, ensuring no skin remained exposed. They were traversing a particularly challenging section of terrain, a steep slope covered in loose, sharp basalt fragments, when disaster struck. Kale had just stepped over a particularly treacherous stretch when his boot dislodged a hidden stone. The shift in weight was subtle, but enough to trigger a small cascade of razor-sharp rock fragments. He tried to leap clear, but a jagged shard, propelled by the falling debris, sliced through his protective gear and deep into his calf muscle. The pain was immediate and intense. Kale gritted his teeth to suppress a cry as he caught himself against a larger boulder. Looking down, he saw his pant leg already darkening with blood, the tear in the fabric revealing a glimpse of the wound beneath. A deep, gaping laceration that had clearly cut through multiple layers of tissue. "Kale is injured," announced Lyra, her empathic abilities making her particularly sensitive to his pain even before her biomonitors registered the change in his vital signs. The squad halted immediately. Zarel was the first to reach him, her slender fingers activating the medical scanner on her wrist device. Laceration, approximately 15 centimeters long, depth ranging from 2 to 3.5 centimeters. Damaged fascia and superficial muscle tissue. Significant blood loss imminent without intervention. By Academy protocols, this injury requires immediate evacuation and termination of the exercise for Squadron Delta. Forelag stood a few paces away, his 4 arms crossed in a posture of frustration. Injured on a simple traverse. This is what happens when we're held back by biological fragility. Lyra knelt beside Kale, already reaching for her field medkit. "We need to call for extraction. I can apply temporary measures, but this needs proper medical attention." Kale looked at each of them, then at the wound. The laceration was bad, worse than he had initially thought. Blood pulsed steadily from the injury, and he could see the pale gleam of exposed muscle tissue. A mandatory evacuation would mean failure for all of them. "No evacuation," he said firmly. "What?" Lyra looked up, startled. "Protocol is clear," stated Zarel. "Injuries of this severity." "My mistake shouldn't cost everyone the exercise," Kale interrupted. "I need my personal medkit. It's in the side pocket of my pack." The 3 aliens exchanged glances, clearly confused by his response. "You cannot continue with this injury," insisted Zarel. "The probability of infection is high. and continued mobility will exacerbate tissue damage. Just give me my kit, Kale repeated, his voice steady despite the throbbing pain. Lyra hesitantly retrieved the medkit from his pack and handed it to him. Kale unzipped the compact pouch and laid out its contents with methodical precision. Antiseptic solution, surgical thread and curved needle, forceps, hemostatic powder, antibacterial ointment, and pressure bandages. "What are you doing?" asked Forelag, moving closer, his earlier disdain replaced by curiosity. "What's necessary?" replied Kale simply. He took a small tube from his personal pocket, the extra analgesic gel he'd packed, and applied a thin line above and below the wound. Within seconds, the immediate area began to numb, though the deeper pain remained. With carefully controlled movements, Kale cleaned the wound using the antiseptic solution, wiping away dirt and blood to reveal the full extent of the damage. The others watched in silence as he worked. "Zarel, can you hold this open?" he asked, indicating the edges of the wound. After a moment's hesitation, the Cygnian complied, her slender fingers precisely maintaining the position he indicated. Kale threaded the curved needle with surgical precision. His hands trembled slightly at first, but then steadied as he focused completely on the task. Taking a deep breath, he positioned the needle at the deepest end of the laceration. The first puncture through his flesh produced a small, soft sound as the needle penetrated skin and muscle. Kale's jaw clenched, but he made no other indication of pain. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he pulled the thread through, creating the first suture with textbook technique. Forelag stood transfixed, his usual imposing stance replaced by rigid shock. All four of his arms hung loose at his sides as he watched the human methodically pierce his own flesh again and again. Zarel's sensors were undoubtedly recording everything: Kale's vital signs, the technique he was using, perhaps even attempting to quantify the pain response that should have been overwhelming him. Her usual analytical detachment seemed compromised by what she was witnessing, her iridescent skin pulsing with rapid patterns that indicated intense concentration or confusion. Lyra had initially turned away when the needle first penetrated skin, but now watched with horrified fascination. Her empathic nature meant she was likely experiencing some echo of Kale's pain, yet she couldn't look away from the surreal scene of calm self-surgery. Stitch by stitch, Kale closed the wound. 9 sutures in total, each placed with careful attention to depth and tension. When the final knot was tied, he applied antibacterial ointment generously over the closed wound, then wrapped it firmly with pressure bandages to minimize movement and provide compression against further bleeding. The entire procedure had taken less than 15 minutes, conducted in near silence, except for Kale's controlled breathing and the occasional instruction to Zarel. When he finished, Kale remained seated for a moment, allowing the wave of pain and lightheadedness to pass. Then, using a sturdy fallen branch that Lyra had quietly retrieved during the procedure, he levered himself to standing. "I'll need 10 minutes to rest," he said, his voice slightly hoarse but steady. "Then we can continue." The silence that followed was profound. Even the perpetual wind of Rykon 7 seemed to have momentarily stilled, though that was surely just coincidence. Forelag was the first to speak, his mandibles clicking in what might have been disbelief. "You just sewed yourself shut. Field medicine is part of standard human military training," Kale replied, as if this explained everything. "But the pain threshold." Zarel seemed to be recalculating something. "Humans are supposed to have average nociceptive sensitivity comparable to most humanoid species. Pain is largely mental," said Kale, shifting his weight carefully to test the bandaged leg, "and completely irrelevant to the mission." Lyra simply stared at him, her empathic senses clearly struggling to reconcile what she had just witnessed. After the brief rest period, Squadron Delta resumed their journey. Their pace was necessarily slower now, with Kale using the makeshift walking stick to support his injured leg. The wound throbbed persistently despite the analgesic, and each step sent a fresh jolt of pain through his calf, but he maintained a steady rhythm, focusing on placing one foot in front of the other. The dynamic of the group had shifted noticeably. Forelag no longer surged ahead impatiently, but instead kept to a pace that Kale could match. More surprisingly, the Cathar warrior now used his considerable strength to clear obstacles from their path, dislodging unstable rocks before they could cause problems, and even helping to create more stable footing on particularly steep sections. Zarel walked slightly behind and to the side of Kale, her sensors occasionally emitting soft beeps as she apparently monitored his vital signs. Every so often, she would ask a brief, technical question. Are you experiencing increasing or decreasing localized inflammation? Or what is your current subjective pain assessment on a scale of 1 to 10? Kale answered each query factually, without embellishment or complaint. When he admitted to a pain level of 6, possibly 7 when bearing weight directly, Zarel's skin flashed with patterns that might have indicated concern, but she made no suggestion to halt. Lyra stayed closest to Kale, frequently offering water or energy concentrates from her pack. Unlike Zarel's clinical interest, Lyra's concern seemed genuinely empathetic, her rose-hued complexion darkening whenever Kale winced slightly at a particularly painful step. "Does your species always respond to injury this way?" she asked during one brief rest period. "Not always," Kale replied. "But when necessary, yes. But why not accept evacuation? The exercise would be rescheduled." Kale looked at her directly. "Because it was my mistake. And in real operations, evacuation isn't always an option." This simple answer seemed to trouble Lyra deeply, but also to increase the respect in her gaze. As afternoon turned to evening on Rykon 7, they faced a new challenge. Their route required passing through a narrow tunnel in a rock formation, a shortcut that would save precious hours compared to going around. The tunnel was tall enough for even Forelag to walk upright, but the passage was dark and echoed strangely. "Bio-readings indicate multiple organisms within," reported Zarel, studying her scanner. "Non-sentient, similar to the fungal species we've observed, but with modal capabilities." "Predatory?" asked Forelag, his hands moving to the training weapons they'd been allowed to bring. "Uncertain. Insufficient data on local ecology." Kale, who had been examining the tunnel entrance, spoke up. "The growth patterns around the opening suggest regular movement in and out. See how the spores have been disturbed in this pattern? Whatever lives in there comes and goes frequently." So, Forelag's patience was clearly wearing thin after the slower pace they'd been forced to maintain. "So, they're likely not territorial predators," explained Kale. "More like foragers or scavengers. They might react defensively if threatened, but probably won't attack unprovoked." Forelag seemed skeptical, but holstered his weapon. "And your suggestion, Wound Stitcher?" The new nickname was delivered without the previous contempt, almost like a reluctant honorific. "Calm, steady movement. No sudden gestures or loud noises. I'll go first." Before anyone could object, Kale limped forward into the tunnel mouth, the illumination from his suit casting long shadows ahead. The others followed after a moment's hesitation. They soon encountered the tunnel's inhabitants, floating, jellyfish-like creatures with bioluminescent tendrils that pulsed with soft blue light. The creatures drifted around the cadets curiously, but maintained distance. "Fascinating," whispered Zarel. "They appear to be responding to our bioelectric fields." One of the creatures drifted too close to Forelag, who instinctively raised an arm in a swift defensive motion. Immediately, all the creature's tendrils flashed bright red, and they began emitting a high-pitched vibration that made the cadets' teeth ache. "Nobody move," ordered Kale quickly. "Forelag, slowly lower your arm." The Cathar warrior complied, though his posture remained tense. The creatures continued their alarm display for several more seconds, then gradually calmed as no further threatening movements occurred. "How did you know?" asked Lyra after they had safely passed through the tunnel, the creatures returning to their peaceful state behind them. Kale shrugged slightly. "Just observation. Many Earth species behave similarly, react to sudden movements but ignore slow ones. Predators pounce, prey flee. Anything that does neither usually isn't a threat." This simple insight seemed to impress the others as much as his earlier self-surgery, though in a different way. They made camp as darkness fell, setting up the minimal shelter allowed by their exercise parameters. The temperature plummeted as predicted, dropping from uncomfortably warm to bitingly cold within an hour of sunset. The bioluminescent fungi that dominated the landscape glowed more intensely in the darkness, casting an eerie blue-green light that created strange, shifting shadows. Kale checked his wound before settling in for the night. The bandage showed some seepage of blood and plasma, but the sutures were holding well. He reapplied antibacterial ointment and replaced the outer bandage, ignoring the sharp pain that came with each movement. "You should elevate that limb," observed Zarel from nearby, where she was precisely arranging her sleep sack for optimal thermal retention. Kale nodded and positioned his injured leg on his rolled-up pack. "Thank you." Forelag, who was taking the first watch, looked over from his position at the perimeter of their small camp. "Will you be able to continue tomorrow?" he asked bluntly. "Yes," replied Kale with equal directness. The Kthar studied him for a long moment, all four eyes focused intently. "Your species is not what I expected." Coming from Forelag, this was practically an effusive compliment. Kale simply nodded in acknowledgement. The next day brought new challenges. Kale's wound had stiffened overnight, making the first hour of walking particularly painful. But as his muscles warmed up, he established a workable rhythm with his makeshift walking stick, and they made steady, if slow, progress. By midday, they reached their first objective, a small automated beacon placed on a rocky outcropping. Zarel interfaced with the device, downloading navigational data for the next stage of their journey. "The second beacon is approximately 18 kilometers southeast," she reported. "Terrain analysis suggests additional fungal forest density and possible water features." "Will we reach it by nightfall?" asked Forelag. Zarel glanced at Kale before answering. "At our current pace, probability is low. We should prepare for another night." Deployment. They continued their trek, encountering increasingly dense growths of the towering fungi. In the thickest parts, the massive stems grew so close together that the cadets had to squeeze through narrow gaps, their protective gear occasionally catching on rough surfaces. During one such tight passage, Lyra suddenly stopped, causing Kale to nearly bump into her. "There's something ahead," she whispered. "Something," frightened and in pain. Her empathic abilities sometimes extended to non-sentient life forms, particularly when strong emotions were involved. The squad proceeded with caution, emerging into a small clearing to find one of the jellyfish-like creatures from the tunnel caught in what appeared to be a natural trap. A sticky secretion from a different fungal species had ensnared its tendrils. The creature's bioluminescence pulsed erratically between red and blue, and it emitted the same high-pitched vibration they had heard in the tunnel. "We should move around it," said Forelag. "This delay is unnecessary." "Wait," said Kale, studying the trapped organism. "This might be important." "Elaborate," prompted Zarel. The distress call could attract predators or more of its kind. Either way, it could complicate our passage. And, he hesitated, it's suffering unnecessarily. Before anyone could object, Kale limped forward and carefully examined the sticky substance trapping the creature. He removed a small utility knife from his belt and, with precise movements, began cutting away the adhesive strands, carefully avoiding contact with both the substance and the creature's tendrils. It took several tense minutes, but eventually the creature was free. It hovered in place for a moment, its glow shifting to a steady purple, then drifted up and away between the fungal canopy. "Interesting choice," commented Zarel. "The time expenditure seems." She was interrupted by a soft humming from above. Looking up, the cadets saw dozens of the jellyfish creatures descending through the canopy, their tendrils glowing with the same steady purple. They circled the clearing once, then aligned themselves to form a living pathway through the densest part of the fungal forest. "They're showing us the way," breathed Lyra. "Or leading us into a trap," muttered Forelag, though he sounded uncertain. "Only one way to find out," said Kale, stepping forward to follow the illuminated path. The creatures did indeed guide them through the most navigable route in the forest, significantly reducing their travel time. When they reached the forest's edge, the jellyfish dispersed back into the canopy with a final pulse of purple light. Forelag shook his head in disbelief. You freed one trapped organism on a whim, and now we've gained allies. Not allies, corrected Kale. Just mutual respect. Maybe. Many species understand reciprocity at some level. They made better progress than expected that afternoon, reaching the second beacon with enough daylight left to establish a more comfortable camp. Kale's wound was clearly troubling him more as the day wore on, his limp becoming more pronounced and sweat beading on his forehead despite the cooling temperature. While Forelag secured the perimeter and Zarel set up their shelter, Lyra insisted on examining Kale's injury. You're running a low-grade fever, she said after scanning him with a medical device. The wound is showing signs of inflammation. Kale nodded tiredly. Expected. My medkit has broad-spectrum antibiotics. He dug out a small packet of pills and swallowed 2 dry before Lyra could even offer water. You should rest. Take the first sleep shift tonight instead of a watch rotation. To her surprise, Kale didn't argue. His uncharacteristic acceptance of the suggestion was perhaps the most concerning indication of his condition. That night, huddled in their shelter as Raikonvai's temperature once again plummeted and eerie sounds echoed from the fungal forest, Lyra, Zarel, and Forelag conferred in low voices while Kale slept fitfully nearby. His condition is deteriorating, stated Zarel. Infection is progressing despite antibiotics. His core temperature has increased by 1.3 degrees. We should call for evacuation, said Lyra firmly. This isn't just an exercise anymore. Forelag's mandibles clicked in agitation. He would refuse. You've seen his determination. Then we don't ask him, replied Lyra. We make the call. No. The quiet word came from Kale, who had apparently awakened. He pushed himself up to a sitting position, wincing slightly. I'm fine. The fever is manageable. The antibiotics need time to work. This is irrational, insisted Zarel. Your condition will continue to deteriorate without proper medical intervention. We're less than a day from the extraction point, countered Kale. If it gets worse, we can call for help then. A tense silence followed, broken finally by Forelag's gruff declaration. We continue as planned. But, he added, fixing Kale with all 4 eyes, if you become unable to walk, I will carry you myself rather than watch you crawl. Understood. Kale studied the Kthar warrior for a moment, then nodded. Understood. The final day of their exercise began with a grim determination. Kale's fever had indeed risen overnight, and the skin around his wound was hot to the touch and reddened beyond the immediate area of the injury. Nevertheless, he insisted on continuing, downing more antibiotics and a mild stimulant from his personal supplies. Their final objective was the most challenging, a steep ascent up a rocky ridge to retrieve the data package that marked completion of their mission, followed by a 5-kilometer trek to the designated extraction point. Under normal circumstances, the climb would have been moderately difficult. In Kale's condition, it looked nearly impossible. I'll retrieve the package, declared Forelag, eyeing the ridge. The rest of you can wait here. Negative, said Kale, his voice hoarse but firm. Squadron exercise. We all complete it together. Forelag looked like he might argue, but instead asked, Can you make the climb? Kale assessed the ridge silently, calculating. Yes, but I'll need help. This simple admission, the first time Kale had acknowledged needing assistance, made the others exchange concerned glances. The ascent was grueling. Kale climbed one-handed, his injured leg dragging painfully behind him as he used his good limbs and the occasional boost from Forelag to make progress. Twice he nearly fell when his fever-weakened grip slipped, saved only by Forelag's quick reflexes or Zarel's anticipatory warnings. By the time they reached the cache containing their data package, Kale was shaking with exhaustion and fever. Sweat soaked his uniform despite the cool air, and his breathing was labored. We have the package, said Lyra urgently. Now we call for extraction from here. 5 kilometers. To designated point, gasped Kale. We finish. Properly. You can barely stand, protested Lyra. Kale straightened with visible effort. 5 kilometers. Downhill mostly. I can make it. Forlag studied him, then nodded sharply. 5 kilometers. He turned to Zarel. Calculate the most efficient route. Minimal elevation changes. The descent from the ridge was faster, but no less challenging for Kale. By now, his wound was a constant pulse of fiery pain that sent tendrils of agony up his leg with each movement. The antibiotics had blunted the edge of the infection, but couldn't eliminate it without proper medical treatment. As they began the final stretch toward the extraction point, Kale stumbled and would have fallen if Forlag hadn't caught him with his lower set of arms. Instead of releasing him, the Cathar warrior maintained his support, bearing a significant portion of Kale's weight. Efficient tactical decision, the warrior said gruffly when Kale looked up in surprise. Maximizes squad mobility. They continued this way, with Forlag bearing more of Kale's weight as the human strength flagged. Zarel led the way, calculating the easiest path meter by meter, while Lyra monitored Kale's vitals and administered the last of his analgesics when the pain threatened to overwhelm him. The extraction point came into view just as the sun was beginning to set on their third day, a flat expanse marked by locator beacons where their transport would land. With a final push, Squadron Delta crossed the designated perimeter, officially completing their mission objective. Kale took 3 more steps beyond the boundary, then his legs finally gave out. Forlag caught him before he hit the ground, lowering him carefully to a sitting position. Mission complete, Kale managed, his face pale and drawn, but wearing a ghost of a smile. You are certifiably insane, stated Forlag, but there was unmistakable respect in his voice. Shuttle incoming, reported Zarel, checking her communications device. Estimated arrival in 12 minutes. Lyra knelt beside Kale, running another scan. Your fever is 39.8 degrees. The infection has spread. You need immediate medical attention. Kale nodded tiredly, no longer arguing now that their objective was achieved. The shuttle appeared as a growing speck in the violet sky, descending rapidly. When it landed and the hatch opened, the medical team rushed out first, alerted by Zarel's transmission of Kale's biometric data. They surrounded him immediately, transferring him to a hover stretcher and beginning treatment even before loading him into the shuttle. Self-inflicted sutures? Exclaimed the chief medical officer, a Versani with 6-fingered hands perfectly evolved for surgical precision. In field conditions? With standard issue equipment. He did it to avoid compromising the mission.